Okay, today we've got a quick video on feudalism in Europe and Japan. We'll also talk a little bit about the Crusades and even sort of track what happens to the story of William the Conqueror. And so we've got a lot to do. The goal is really to give some foundational knowledge and really set you up for our movie, which will be Robin Hood with Russell Crowe. Really good film. So let's get started. I like to talk to students about feudalism and just really know that this is a dangerous world. You know, coming out of the Dark Ages, there are a lot of different kings. This is a divided place. And the first thing you got to know is what feudalism is. It is land for protection. That is, I give you some land. You're either going to work that land, you're going to build a castle on that land, but ultimately I'm giving you that land with the expectation that you do some protection. That you help me, serve me, and that's sort of the trade-off. So land is the biggest currency of sorts. Land is, there's no need for money. Land is what is most important under feudalism. So to sum it up, it is giving somebody land in exchange for protection. These are going to be knights in Europe, but samurai in Japan. Okay. So we've got a bunch of vocab terms that you should know. So feudalism is land for protection. Manorialism is land for food. This is sort of the bottom of the European social structure and the Japanese social structure, that serfs or peasants will work the land and they will give some of the food to the lords, and the lords will protect them. And that's how manorialism works. Right? Land in exchange for some food. And so you have this back and forth sort of trade-off. A fief, and I know it doesn't look like that, but a fief is that land that you are going to give. So if I'm a lord, if I'm sort of third step on my pyramid, I'm not quite a king, but I'm certainly very, very important, I can be granted a fief, or grant somebody a fief. And the goal is really to give them some incentive to stay on that land, either to work the land, or may even give a knight a fief for their great service. You will hear the term thrown around called vassal, and a vassal is just a part of the military. I don't want to say exactly another name for soldier, but certainly sort of the same idea. A vassal is somebody who is going to serve a lord, and lords can be vassals that serve other lords. And it gets really complicated, and there's this big web. And just remember, my goal here is not to tell you everything about feudalism, but to just give you broad ideas, okay, broad vocabulary, so you can be competent with it. Knights, you know what a knight is, right? They serve, they fight, and they have this code of honor called chivalry. And I always ask the ladies, is chivalry still around, or is chivalry dead? And, I get very, very competing responses, but overwhelmingly, this idea that treating women the right way and bravery and honor in battle are things that chivalry talked about and chivalry really preached. You have serfs, which are on the bottom of the pyramid, and I just want you to know that the difference between a peasant and a serf is that while peasants have the opportunity to leave the land, to leave the manor, serf doesn't. Picture them like they're sort of chained to the land. They're not going anywhere. They're stuck there, and ultimately they are bound to that land. And the last word that you'll see thrown around occasionally is called a tithe. And so the most important thing to know about feudal Europe is that religion was everything. Everybody's lives centered around religion. Well, the church was able to take advantage of that by making sure that people paid their tithes or paid their taxes. And these taxes provided revenue for the churches to build these beautiful, beautiful cathedrals that will become like the hallmark of the Middle Ages. Okay, so you've got a system of feudalism right there. You've got your king on the top, you've got your nobles, and you've got your knights with peasants on the bottom. In other words, I tell my students, KNKP, right? Kings, nobles, knights, peasants. KNKP. This is the basic structure. This is not sort of this complete structure, but certainly gives you an idea. Now here's the key understanding. Why do we go to feudalism? We go to it because there isn't just one king coming out of the Dark Ages. There wasn't one king that sort of was able to unite everybody. And so what you get are many different kings. And all these different kings don't really get along with one another. And they're vying for power. They're vying for a world in which, you could be invaded by Vikings at any time. You've got Germanic tribes still roaming around with things like, were guilds, money for a man, or the ordeals where you had to hold a hot iron, whether that was telling the truth or not. All these different groups running around, and people are looking for safety. And so what feudalism offers them, right? Land for protection, so it offers people safety. And it occurs because there is now one central government to be able to control all of Europe, and so you get this division. It's a very political system. This is your government, right? This is how government works. You listen to the king. The king has nobles to obey them, and it's this chain of command that feudalism is known for. Manorialism makes sure that everybody can eat. It is the economic system. So kings struggle, right? How do you sort of protect all these people? And so what people start to do is they start to get away from necessarily being in big cities, and they start to go to the countryside. And peasants will start to take a little cut for themselves and ultimately rely on their lords, rely on their knights for basic protection. And they offer food because that is their trade-off. So if feudalism is land for protection, manorialism is land for food. I'm getting a plot of land, but I'm going to expect some food in return. So you got this medieval manor system going around, and basically what you would do is you would leave one field fallow. Fallow means I'm not going to put anything in it. With the idea, or with the intention, that one field will regain all of its nutrients and the nutritious soil, and then come next year, it'll be ready to be harvested. It'll be ready to be used. So you leave one field unused, you use everything else, and at the end of the day, hopefully, you will have a group of fields that are going to be used for a very, very, very long time. You won't exhaust all the nutrients in your soil. I hope that makes sense. Along with the crop rotation system, you've got other things. Water mills, windmills, they're developing plows to get into the fields. There's a lot here. You're seeing that food production is going to increase, and whenever you increase food production, behind it, you're going to get an increase in population. Now, I like to talk about students talking about life of serfs, right? It's the life that you probably live. 60% of the people are going to be serfs, right? So if that much of the population is serf, you should know a little bit about what they were doing. So not only are they stuck to the land, they can't go anywhere. They need permission. They're going to work day and night. Not going to live very long. Bread and ale, that's what you're eating, unless it's a holiday, right? Holidays like Easter or Christmas, you're gonna get like a pass of some sort where you're gonna be able to eat some meat, but don't be thinking that you're gonna be eating that every day. And I found a fact that most peasants, you're drinking like 3 gallons of ale a day. That's ridiculous. It's a lot. But it's not like, the strongest alcohol or something like that. It's certainly watered down, and it was just their staple. It was their way of life. A typical scene of what a feudal town could look like. I'm not saying they all look this way, but it certainly gives you a picture of where everything is. And at the heart of every feudal town is going to be that church. Okay, the church is the center of life. And people who were serfs, they'll live in like very simple dwellings. One room, everyone's sort of stuck together. Maybe you get 2 rooms. The animals are probably sleeping with you, and that's going to be a problem for much later on. So you got the church, you got the big cathedrals. Those are the things that bring people together. And we're talking the Catholic Church here. That's really where we want to go for Europe, not the Eastern Orthodox Church of Russia. You're focused on the Catholic Catholic Church. And so you have a pope on the top, right? And there's this complicated order, but you should know that the pope makes the decisions for the Catholic Church. They collect the tithes. You've got priests that are going to teach Christianity. A lot of times these priests are speaking in Latin. So if you do the math there, do you think a lot of serfs could speak and read that Latin? Probably not. So they're probably sitting in service, not having any idea what the pastor or the priest is saying. And that was church for people, but they believed in it. They believed in going to church every day and praying and making sure that they were sort of washing away their sins. And so this was a staple in everybody's life. You would look sort of like an outcast if you did not go to church, okay? You were certainly the minority if you did not go to church. So at the center of the Middle Ages, of course, the church with the Pope on top. You've got the Catholic Church. You've got monks. You've got nuns. You've got this monks living in priories. You've got nuns living in nunneries, sort of separate, sort of isolated from everybody. They'll come out big during the plague years of Europe, for sure. So you got a monk on the left. You got a nun on the right. Sort of just building your idea of who these people are. Okay, so here's a really great map just to show you sort of how broken up Europe was by the year 1000. You've got many different kingdoms. You've got a caliphate that's sort of growing. If you look down in the south towards Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba, there's this growing concern, right, that the Muslim armies are spreading north. And of course, there's going to be a cultural war that will erupt, and we know that cultural war is the Crusades, a battle over the Holy Land. But I won't go there just yet. Now, as these kingdoms are spreading up, 300 years pass, and something horrible is going to happen. You see, as these kingdoms are operating separately, they eventually are looking to make a little bit of money off of the trade. And there is a growing trade through the Chinese Empire being controlled by the Mongols will happen, but in China there's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of trade going on, and the great Khans, the Mongols, they want that trade to continue to keep going, and so they keep the Silk Road open. That Silk Road, that imaginary road that goes from China and Asia all the way to Europe, bringing with it a lot of cultural diffusion. And remember, we talk about it, right? How these cultures sort of clash and collide with one another through cultural diffusion. And the Silk Road is an example of that, okay? Biggest example, probably. Well, cultural diffusion can be good, but it can be bad, too. And we see it with the Black Death. We see it with the bubonic plague, where that plague is going to come in, spread by the fleas that are carried by rats and gerbils and all this kind of stuff, and it's going to come in. And I just want you to know that the most important thing I can help you understand about the bubonic plague is that people thought the world was ending. It was to that level. People believed that God was going to wield a holy judgment upon the people, that that's why he spread this disease, that it came from God, and that God was trying to punish the people. And with that fear in mind, people are going to leave cities, leave their families, right? We see some of the awful parts of human sort of dignity being lost. And on the other hand, you have monks and nuns, particularly nuns, who rise to the occasion and take in sick people and are willing to work with people that nobody else is. So you see some of the good in some of the bad in humanity through the bubonic plague. All right, so that's just sort of a summary introduction to feudal Europe, sort of the major definitions, major vocab. So on the one hand, you've got feudal Europe. You also should be able to compare and at least understand some common traits between feudal Europe and feudal Japan. And they've got rough time period, 1185 to 1168. Again, time period isn't as exact of importance to our class as it is to comparing them across cultures. Okay, and remember, we're just trying to introduce stuff. So I always start with, can we have honor and defeat? And for samurai, there was no honor and defeat. And so, feudal Japanese society worked like this. You have an emperor on top, but that emperor is more of a figurehead. They sort of have this concept of them having royal blood and really become the son of heaven. Like, they are, by all accounts, a holy person. They, by all accounts, are supposed to be chosen by God. But that doesn't mean that they have the most power. It just means that they may have a lot of respect. Okay? It is the people who wield the sword below him that really have the power. And we call these people shoguns. These are the warlords. These are the people that take over through fire and ash, through bloodshed, through wielding a sword, and take over land. And they give that land to people called daimyos. And the daimyos then turn around and make sure that the land is protected by samurai. And you have this system that sort of works and keeps the emperor on top. It's the shoguns, though, that lead the battles. It's the shoguns that are going to unify Japan. And ultimately, it's the shoguns that have the true power. And of course, in the bottom, just like feudal Europe, you've got peasants. And it's sort of split. You have merchants, you have artisans that are specialty sort of craftsmen. But none of those people have the same respect as you would a samurai. Okay? Certainly not the economic power of a daimyo, and certainly not the political power of a shogun. Okay, so feudal Japan. A lot of different vocab words, things to know. You should know what a samurai is, that they wield katanas, and I've talked to you about seppuku, or at least I hope I have, that ritual where you take a sword, you put it right into your stomach, okay, and then you turn it to one side, and that will spill your guts out. While your friend comes from behind, somebody that you care about, somebody that you respect a lot, and that friend will take their sword and chop your head right off. And that was supposed to give you an honorable death. So if you were given a task and you could not complete that task, maybe the emperor told you to stop a plot against one of his shoguns, but you failed. Well, then you would commit seppuku. You would commit this ritual suicide, and hopefully that would put you in good favor with the gods and give you something honorable. Okay? We've talked about daimyos, shoguns, and emperors. We've done that. So the code of Bushido. One thing that you should know about this code is that it doesn't just matter to feudal Japan. It's going to matter to imperial Japan come World War II. It is this code that you do not lose. That when you are fighting in battle, this is about winning. You are not going to quit. It will become the basis for this 10-to-1 strategy later on in history, where the Japanese are taught you have to take 10 Americans with you before dying. This is a World War II concept. So the Code of Bushido, all about honor, all about sacrifice, all about willing to fight to the end. And samurai follow it. And for us, if we're going to compare cultures, Code of Bushido acts a lot like chivalry does. Okay, it gives the warriors of the societies something to follow, something to keep them on the right path. Part of Japanese society, you should know something about Shinto. Shinto is a nature-worshipping religion, sort of akin to the idea of animism, where you've got the real glorification of the natural world, of nature. And you'll see it in their art, really, really cool stuff. I've got like a painting or two in here, but I don't really do it service. I think there's a lot more that you could go look into. And lastly, Zen Buddhism is a take on Buddhism, right? But there's this really, really intense part of Zen Buddhism that samurai really need to become at peace with themselves. And a warrior in total control of himself is the most powerful warrior. And so there's real honor to being a samurai, but there takes this real mental dedication to being a samurai warrior. Sort of the reason why you can even fathom seppuku, where you're going to commit ritual suicide. You don't do that if you're not composed 100,000,000% to your cause and really committed. It's this different level of of understanding, I think. Okay. Now again, we're trying to introduce things, so you got to take a look at that map and know a little bit about Japanese geography. And the first thing I always tell students is take a look at the islands, look at the chain, and notice that Japan is a seahorse, right? Take a look. Now the Japanese believe, the great dragon. You can probably see the dragon too, but I always make the joke that it's the great seahorse. It is an archipelago. It is a series or chain of islands. Japan is a very volcanic area, and so a lot of volcanoes. And part of the thing about Japan is, because it's a series or chain of islands, it only has the resources that are there. It can't go out and get new resources on the island. Once it takes away all of its raw material, that's it, right? So Japanese will be prone to eventually either trading or B, taking other people's resources. And again, story for World War II, but just sort of planting the seeds in your mind. When you run out of natural resources, something is going to happen for you to make sure that your people eat. Something as easy as trade, or something as evil as imperialism, taking over others. So, chain of islands, Japan, it, for the most part, has stayed outside of other nations. It doesn't really like to contact with other nations. And there are moments, I'll talk about a couple of different exceptions and things, but I mean to a real level where isolationism is on their minds, clearly. I mean, they only had one port of trade, Nagasaki. World War II buffs, you should know a little bit about that. And ultimately, this mountainous region is good for defense, but the lack of resources is going to require some offense later. Call it the Ring of Fire. Hopefully in earth science you've seen something like this, where it's certainly the high volcanic activity near Japan. Okay, so Japan wasn't just like born unified or something like that. The feudalism, they're going to get unified. And Japan engages in something called selective borrowing. Basically, what they're going to do is take some of the things from the Chinese that they want, and some of the things that they don't want from China, they're just not going to be interested in. They're not going to take it. Selective borrowing is cultural diffusion, but it's, again, not to be redundant, but it's very selective cultural diffusion. They're all picking the things that they want and forgetting the things that they don't. So they even give the title the Son of Heaven, and that should sound really, really familiar. The Son of Heaven, Emperor, should remind you of, like, maybe the mandate of heaven given to the Chinese emperors. And so what you see here is just a little bit of that cultural diffusion spreading into Japan. Not a lot, but certainly a little. And during the Heian period, what Japan is going to do is use feudalism as a way to make the clans come together and bring peace. That I'll give you some land, but I'm going to expect that you make some peace, that you don't fight anymore. Now, this is the big moment in Japanese history where I think things could have changed drastically. I mean, it certainly changed for the Chinese people. They were conquered by the Mongols. But the shoguns held off the Mongols twice, 1274, 1281. And I would argue that it really is less about the sophistication of the Japanese military or necessarily the bravery of the samurai, but rather maybe they got really, really lucky. You see, the Mongols had tried 2 separate times, on 2 separate occasions, to go from China to Japan with a fleet of ships. And both times a storm destroyed those ships, just wiped out those fleets. And so what the Japanese started to believe was that they were protected by God. And so they started to come up with a name for this storm, that it protected them twice from what is one of the, if not the strongest empire that we may have ever seen. They called it the kamikaze storms. And that word, kamikaze, it should mean something later on. The Japanese are going to take that word to them in Pearl Harbor. But again, I'm getting too far off track. Okay, so they have saved themselves from the Mongolian invasion, and the shoguns are eventually going to want to vie for power. And if you were taking a course on Japanese history, you would know all about the Onin Wars. Unfortunately, we just got to know the basics of it. Their capital city is destroyed. There is battles between different shoguns, but the shogun that wins is named Oda Nobunaga. Oda, not Yoda, Nobunaga, even though his gown looks green and all that kind of stuff. Oda, not Yoda, Nobunaga. No Star Wars references here, right? And Oda Nobunaga is, through the Tokugawa shogunate, he passes the Edict of 1635. Here's what it basically says. If you are a Japanese citizen and you try to leave, okay, leave the island, and you come back, and we find out about it, that you left the island and came back, you're dead. They're going to chop your head clean off. And the reason why they did that is they believed that other cultures were barbaric. They believed that if other cultures came to Japan, they would water down this great Japanese culture, that they would bring harm to the Japanese culture, and they wanted to keep it pure. They didn't want any outsiders. And so the Edict of 1635 really accomplishes that. I mean, for the most part, you're not going to see anybody coming into Japan. It remains isolated. It's pretty effective. It's total ethnocentrism. I believe that I'm the best culture in the world and nobody else should step to me. It's also kind of a violent way of forcing ethnocentrism, too. And it won't be until 1853 when, knock, 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 America comes with 4 black ships and a man named Commodore Matthew Perry. Story for another day, though. So there's a statue, Oda Nobunaga, who has unified the clans, the Tokugawa shogunate. He has won victory in the Onin Wars, and he has established an isolated Japan. And that's really where I want to leave you with feudalism and Japan. Okay? So if you need a break, please pause it. It'd be a good spot to pause and really reflect on the samurai, the Kota Bushido, all that kind of good stuff. And what I'll do is I'll keep moving forward, and if you look at, this is a great comparison of the two systems. You got on the one hand Europe, and on the other hand Japan. And it sort of gives you, these are just different words to describe the same things. You got a pope on one side, you got an emperor on the other, and they're similar. They're the religious, spiritual leaders. You've got a monarch, or king, right? And then you've got a shogun. And this chart really reflects and looks at just how similar these things are and where the commonalities line up. But just a sort of sidebar to this whole thing, the Japanese didn't see the merchants as a very good state to be in. The pursuit of money is a very cultural thing. So the merchants will be lower on a Japanese society than the European society, which gave more wealth to those who were able to trade for goods and peddle their wares and things. All right. Now, this map looks complicated, and it's probably really the hardest thing that I have to do in this unit is talk to you about how trade sort of revitalizes after the bubonic plague. So there's a big problem in the Middle Ages with a fragmented political structure. When you don't have one king, there's not one rule, there's not one set of trade rules. It gets messy, it gets dicey. There are invasions and disease to the north. That second bullet, I'd really like you to know that it's not only invasions, but disease as well. You've got some towns and cities that are not exactly safe places to be in. But eventually, in the 11th and the 12th century, after the bubonic plague is going to have its waves, right? But the people are going to try their best to open up trade. And 2 cities that you should know would be Venice and Flanders. Venice, closer to Italy, closer to the Pope, right, in Rome. Makes a lot of sense that there's some power there. But in the north, you've got Flanders. You've got, which is, very close to Viking country, right? There's going to be explosion of trade. And these trade routes will only increase as time goes on. These cities will only get more powerful as the time sort of goes. And one of the things that they start to do, and this is after plague years now, is they develop a system, a group of cities that dominate trade. These cities will have trade fairs where all merchants can come and sell their wares in one central location. And if you belong to this group, I mean, that's where the economy starts to flow. It's called the Hanseatic League. And I know it doesn't look like that, but it's the Hanseatic League. And the goal of the Hanseatic League is to make sure that trade is prospering, right? And to make sure that Europeans are on the upswing. But I would argue that the Hanseatic League opens the door to our next revolution in history. And it's one that we probably don't talk enough about. It's the commercial revolution. It's the one that students really forget about, to be honest with you. And it's this real big switch from a barter economy that feudalism had, where I'll give you a goat, you give me a sword, to now we're going to use money. We're going to come up with a currency, ducats, right, in Italy. We're going to come up with some sort of economic system that relies on money and not just trading goods or trading for services. I'm a barber, so I give you a nice edge up, and you give me, I don't know, you fix my shoes because, my shoes are broken. Okay, it doesn't work like that anymore, or at least it's moving towards not working that way. And the commercial revolution changes history, and I believe that, because now with the use of money, you start to get like banking systems. You start to get this thing called capitalism, which is a system that we live in, where you've got private businesses. You can open your own business. You can move up in society. And as the banking system gets bigger, and we rely on money more often, what you start to see is people can, through banking, take risks that they otherwise may not have been able to do. And so what we'll see, later on in the 1400s, the late 1400s, of course, and early 1500s, is that people start to take more risks with money, and they start to send overseas ventures. They start to send people in ships looking for their ways to get a cut of the Silk Road trade. And hello, Christopher Columbus is going to end up finding an entire continent. Okay, so the banking system opens a door in human history that was previously closed. It allows people to put a little bit of money into a bank, and that, a little bit more, and ultimately they can form a business, what we call joint stock companies, that can finance these great voyages. So we'll talk more about that, just kind of introducing it to you. So out of this slide, the one thing that I want you to know is commercial revolution. Switch from the barter economy to using money. You say it a million times if that's what you got to do, but you must know what the commercial revolution is. And I'd be lying if I told you that this was just a great thing for humanity. I mean, there's problems too. Okay, while the towns are close to a manor, you've got a government that develops. You've also got crowded, polluted, nasty places that start to develop. You've got fire that's a constant danger because a lot of these structures are made of wood. And so if you got fire in one shack, or you've got fire in one house, or one, your candle maker in your shop goes up, I mean, the whole block could go up. Okay, so that's a real danger in these cities. You've got a lot of water pollution, people not understanding the difference between wastewater and wash water, and so disease often spreads. There are problems. Now, as the economy starts getting more complicated through capitalism, right, the people come up with ways to protect themselves. And they come up with this really interesting idea of a guild. Basically what a guild is a group of the same craftsmen. So a bunch of candle makers come together. Master candle makers, right? And they agree to set a certain price, $5 per candle or something, right? And everyone agrees to that same price. Well, if everyone does, you must buy from one of us. And no matter who you buy from, if you're going to get the same price, it reduces that competition. And this way, we're all making money instead of, just one person or another person making money. And so these guilds become that avenue to controlling prices. They also control quality, So we all make the same type of candle, you know, the same quality candle, the same height, whatever, burning wick, all that kind of stuff. And maybe the strength of a medieval guild is that they controlled how many people entered the profession. So they controlled how many people would apprentice as a clockmaker to make sure that there wasn't, like, instead of 5 clockmakers, 50 clockmakers. Because remember, if there's too many of one, the price starts to get messed up. If there's so many clockmakers and we're all competing with one another, that could cause problems. So these guilds are ways for people to organize, and they really function like modern day unions. They function like how unions do today, where we bargain for pricing and salaries and all that kind of stuff. Similar concept, similar idea. So, a couple of things. They set the standards of quality. How good is that candle going to be? How good is that clock going to be made? They tell you, what the price is going to be set at, and ultimately how many people are going to enter your field. So that's if you're a part of a guild. Right? And they have these really fancy seals, and I always ask my students every year to make a guild seal of their chosen profession. Okay. With that, now that we've got feudalism, now that we've got a commercial revolution, let's tackle the Crusades. So what do you know about the Crusades? And often when I ask my students this question, a lot of what they start to talk about are the Knights Templar. They talk a little bit about religion, but it seems to me that we don't really have a full picture of what the Crusades were. That simply to say that they were just simply holy wars, I want a more balanced approach. I want you to know sort of the full story, and then you can take it and you can sort of make your own meaning behind this. So we'll look at it from 2 angles, from a more materialist perspective, and then certainly a more idealist perspective as well. And we'll get you both sides. So a great map to sort of talk about when the Crusades were going on, 1096 to 1204, and there are many of them. I mean, you got up to 4 Crusades, and some people say more than that. I mean, it can get very complicated. So I don't want to say glossing over, but I'm doing a little bit of the highlights because we do have so much that I want to talk about. So consider it an introduction. If you're looking for like a basic definition of what the Crusades are, we call them holy wars, fought over the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem down in the Middle East. Look to the south of the map. You got to know where Jerusalem is in this class. That's important. It's like knowing where Constantinople is. Got to know where that is, or knowing where Rome is. Those places are all places that you should be able to easily recognize on a map. And Jerusalem may be the most important. Okay. And the 2 groups, Muslims, Seljuk Turks, okay, the same Seljuk Turks that are eventually going to have something to do with the fall of Constantinople, right? And then, of course, the Christians, whom many called Franks, okay, and that has to do with where they came from in France, okay, the Frankish people. And that goes a little back to like Clovis and Charles the Hammer Martel and all that kind of stuff. So, why Jerusalem is probably the best question you could ask. So, this is a holy land for all different groups of people. So first, it's a holy land for the Jews because that's where the Temple of Solomon was built. That's the land that, when I told you that story about the Jewish people and Yahweh promising them a specific piece of land, yeah, Jerusalem was that piece of land that they were promised according to the Old Testament. So for the Jewish people, it's their homeland. For the Muslims, it's also an important place because that's where Muhammad, remembering that story I told you, was transported to heaven, where he visited Allah, where the Archangel Gabriel was talking to him and showing him heaven and showing him hell, right? And then he came right back down to the Dome of the Rock and he was in Jerusalem. And so that's a holy place for the Muslim people. It is a place where Muhammad went, very, very important to them. And then last but not least, this is a place where the Christians go because they believe that Jesus was crucified here and that this is the land where he walked. And so for the Jewish people, for the the Muslim people, for the Christian people, this is holy land to them across all faiths, okay? So they want that territory, not just because it's a hotbed of trade. Yes, it was, but it had specific religious significance to each group of people. And I try to teach my students that the 3 basic ways to understand why you would become a crusader, or why you would join the Seljuk Turk army, or why you would want to go to Jerusalem, okay, is God, gold, and glory. Those things sort of operate behind us. But there are many, many others. You've got religion at the center of people's life. That's everything for a feudal serf, knight, noble, king. That's everything for you. But oh, by the way, the Pope's got his hand in this. Pope Urban II is an example, but others will come that say, if you join me in my fight for Jerusalem, automatic salvation. You are going to heaven. And for people who have had to sin, for people who have done bad things, this is a way out, guys. This is a way to heaven, and they take it. And oh, by the way, you could also gain a lot of riches in Jerusalem because there's a lot of holy relics down there. That's where the trade is. It's a crossroads of culture, so there's a lot of cultural diffusion. But ultimately, you could be famous, you could be very rich. And so the 3 top reasons are God, right, religion, and salvation. Gold, because Jerusalem was a hotbed of trade, and glory. You can make a name for yourself out there. You can get a cool nickname like Richard the Lionheart, or something like that. Now, the 2 sides of the conflict, the Crusaders, these are heavily armored and defended well soldiers. Their elite guard are called Templars, and they have their own navy, their own banking system. I mean, they're very, very connected. These are the elite of the elite. And of course, if you played like Assassin's Creed or something, you know all about Templars, and or at least you think you do. And so they are famous for using siege engines, these big, big structures that are used to take down walled cities. Look something like that. They've got wheels on them, and you can get your men up. Instead of just using a ladder, you've got this big engine that you can protect yourself and ultimately get into cities that are highly, highly fortified, highly well defended. So on the one hand, you got the slow-moving Crusaders. On the other hand, you've got the Seljuk Turks, who are quicker. They use the horses. They are archers, right? They are not going to be with this heavy chainmail armor. Instead, they're going to be lighter on their feet. And they come up with, instead of siege engines, they've got this thing called Greek fire. This like sticky napalm-like substance that is massively effective against the Crusaders. Brutal, really. So the First Crusade was launched in 1096. And it was Duke Godfrey that came across. He wanted the help of, or tried to help, the Byzantine Empire Alexios. And remember, the reason why we don't talk about many Byzantine emperors is because they weren't that great after Justinian. And so the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. They were able to do it. First Crusade, boom, that goes to the Crusaders. They've won, or so they think. The Second Crusade, Nur al-Din of the Seljuk Turks is able to push back the Crusaders at a place called Damascus. And when that happens, the Crusaders, they lost. The Seljuk Turks are in Jerusalem, right? And so the Second Crusade is sort of like this, tug-of-war game. First, the Crusaders get the upper hand. Now the Seljuk Turks get it back. And now we are sitting there as the Europeans. They wanted to take back the Holy Land. They wanted a Third Crusade, but they ran out of money. And so they started to try to get that money, and not in always great ways. It's embarrassing, really, that the Jewish people have to face more persecution. They are robbed. They have their money taken from them. And it's all in the name of raising an army. They call the taxes that go toward paying for this war effort the Saladin tithe, because the leader of the Muslim armies at this time. His name was Saladin. And so you've got people selling land to try to fund this money, to put themselves in good graces of the church, and ultimately there are many ways that they funded the money, but ultimately they're going to get it. And it comes to this headway. This is probably the one that I would like you to know more about than any other. And the war for the Third Crusade is fought between Saladin on the left and Richard the Lionheart on the right. Okay, these are the two guys that you should know something about. That Saladin was the leader of the Seljuk Turks, and that Richard the Lionheart is the leader of the Crusaders and was the King of England at the time. The conflict isn't an ending the way that maybe you thought it would be. They end in a treaty, and the treaty is, Christians, you can come into the city. There's no tax that you have to pay. There's sort of like this more like sharing of the Holy Land, at least for the Third Crusade. And the Third Crusade was brutal on both sides. The example that I give is the massacre at Acre, where Richard the Lionheart, he just takes the lives of the Muslim prisoners of war. And his argument was that these prisoners of war would go back and support Saladin, and he'd be fighting this battle all over again. But on the other side, I mean, these were prisoners of war, and there was some sort of respect among generals between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. He kind of violated that respect and violated their honor that they had sort of showed one another. And so on the left, you've got Saladin, awesome painting by the way, and then on the right, you've got Richard the Lionheart. So, 3 Crusades that we talked about, Saladin, Richard the Lionheart are the two people. But if I'm being honest with you, when it comes down to sort of regions-based questions, they aren't so interested in the people. They're more interested in the big effects. So I'll do them. You got to know this, right? It's increased cultural diffusion. You've got 2 different cultures meeting in one spot, going back and forth. It's not just war that's exchanged, but trade, cultural values, and ideas are going to be exchanged. So the theme of our class shows up in every unit, and this unit is no different. The Crusades increase the power of the church, like tremendously. You thought that the church was a part of their lives before. It is so much so the only thing that matters, and their power is just increased because their economic power has increased. They have fought and gathered so much land and so much wealth for the church that you're really seeing a big power shift. You're going to see more trade that's going to go through. You're going to see that kings are more powerful, and it's not in the reason that you'd think that it would be. The lords that were sent to the crusade battles to fight for Jerusalem, a lot of them don't come back. Now, some of them, may have chosen to settle, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the lords that died over in the Crusades. They don't come back. The king doesn't have to do much with that land now. The king can take that land as he sees fit. And, yeah, sure, it should go to the oldest son. Some of those sons were all fighting. And so the king starts to really cement power. And you're going to start to see them get away from that concept of feudalism as a king's power sort of starts to increase. And this will eventually become a key part in why the Protestant Reformation was so successful. But oh, by the way, keep this one in the back of your mind. Crusades opened the door to cultures and societies that many people had only sort of heard of in distant talks about the Battle of Tours and the fight over the Muslim armies in Cordoba. There is a new sense that there's a bigger world here, and that maybe we should start exploring that bigger world. Okay, so we talked about the Crusades. You got feudalism, land for protection. You got manorialism, land for food. Now I just want to finish up and get you ready by talking about northern Europe, like Flanders area, right? And we're going to talk about this land called Normandy to really pick up the story where I left off talking about the Vikings. Northern France had been hit really hard. You see, there were the Gallic people. the same people that Julius Caesar had conquered. Their king Vercingetorix had been defeated, right? So those people, the Gallic people, would eventually become the French people. Those people were in constant contact with the Vikings, and it wasn't always very good. In fact, it wasn't good very often. Now, they are going to be conquered, these Gallic people, and they're conquered by these people called the Northmen. And eventually the Northmen, the Vikings, okay, are going to take on a new name. Not Northmen, but Norsemen. And the Norsemen call their land Normandy, okay? And so this land that they built, this land that they are going to take over and control, has a place in history. We call this era where Normandy is becoming a relevant place, the High Middle Ages. Sites of the commercial revolution, right? And the man that's able to conquer Britain, he's a Norseman. His name is William the Conqueror. And he takes his Norsemen in, these Viking warriors, and he defeats the king of Britain. And he is able to take over this land. And what William the Conqueror does, like any smart king, is he starts giving land out to those knights who served him along the way, as long as they take loyalty oaths. So he's sort of making them happy, but he's doing what he knows. Feudalism, land for protection. He's trying to protect himself, while at the same time making those people loyal to him, rich and wealthy. And he's going to try to control this area the best way he knows how. He is going to use marriage as his big tool. So he would marry his people into the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxon people of England, and the Norman people and the Anglo-Saxon people come together to preserve peace. And of course, that's an example of cultural diffusion, right? You've got a literal mixing of cultures. You've got the new language that comes out of this Anglo-Saxon, Norman molding and melding. We call it English. Maybe you've heard of that. William is also going to try to raise funds for his new growing empire, and he has to take a census. And this is really a famous thing that you should look into more. It's called the Domesday Book. Basically what it was is you take a ledger, you take a survey of all of the lands and all of the wealth, so that you can make sure that you tax everyone appropriately and effectively, so that no one goes underneath the tax bracket. You can get the max amount of money that you can. So he was very good at record keeping and making sure that people couldn't dodge taxes as easily. I'm not saying that it never happened. Of course it was tax dodging, but he certainly tried to raise revenue the best way he could. And this is a word, I think I've used it before, but you should know it. It's called a census. We still have those today. Basic definition. You're taking a look at population, and he used his census as a way of determining wealth. Okay. After William, you will have kings that make something called common law. And common law is, as you would think, common laws for everybody, so a set of laws that everyone should follow. But the kings struggle, because you've got a church, you've got nobles, and it's tough to strike that balance. If there's one thing that you can see about feudalism, is that there are a lot of different people that have power under a feudal structure. So it's very, very difficult, don't give them too much land, don't praise this family above the other, and it becomes very complicated. And again, I'm sort of leaving out a lot, but the goal is that I want you to understand that the kings and nobles and the church, it's this constant balancing act, and it's very difficult to strike the right balance. Maybe William the Conqueror is able to do it, but it's future kings that struggle with that. A king to know, not just for this class, but even for Global 2, is King John. Okay, King John has a lot of wealth, and I think he takes too much wealth. Peasants are running out of food. His taxes are way, way too high. And so because of these two things, and his nobles start even getting hurt by all these high taxes, we will see that King John's going to lose power in a sort of political way. So economically, this is where you get the rise of Robin Hood, where he's stealing from the rich and, you know, giving to the poor, taking those tax collectors down, right? Going after the power of King John. And this is the town of Nottingham, a really, really cool story that we're going to watch in class. The nobles eventually rise up. And when they do, they eventually get King John to sign the famous Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta does is it puts a limit on the king's power. It says that before you make decisions, you must you must conversate with your nobles, with your lords. Not to say that this is, you know, total democracy in England. It's not. It's not even a limited monarchy, okay, in the sense of the word, like the English Revolution had. But it's a way of checking the king's power, the Magna Carta, and it opens up the door that maybe a king should not have full control, that maybe a king's power needs to be limited in some ways. And for that it is remembered as this great document that takes a shot at absolute power and reduces it down just a little bit. And as we'll see in the future, things are going to change. The Magna Carta is the starting point. It is not the ending point, guys. Okay. So, I'll leave you with some cool images of feudal Europe, of the great cathedrals. I hope that this has helped give you a quick snapshot into feudal Europe, to Europe in the north, to Europe in the Middle East, in their cultural wars called the Crusades. And ultimately, you got to know feudalism, land for protection, manorialism, land for food. The Crusades are holy wars. And you should know a thing or two about William the Conqueror and how his use of power shaped Great Britain. Because we will come back to them when we talk about them in 2. All right. Have a good one, guys. Hope this helped.